Welcome everyone to the first of our online mini-series of debates in African Liberation Awareness Month. This is a partnership between Extinction Rebellion Bristol, African Voices Forum, Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network, and Extinction Rebellion Youth. Very excited to have you all here tonight. And for those of you who may not be aware, African Liberation Awareness Month is a time to celebrate and honour African heritage and the resistance of Africa and its descendants across the world. The climate and ecological emergency poses one of the greatest risks to all life on Earth, in particular the continent of Africa, which is highly susceptible to floods, droughts, displacement of peoples, famines, extreme weather conditions, and many other byproducts of the climate and ecological emergency. So Extinction Rebellion have sounded the alarm in the last 2 years and brought climate change into the mainstream when we took to the streets and forced our government to listen. We changed public policy, won high court rulings, mobilized a global movement, but the climate movement, unfortunately, has not succeeded in engaging and empowering diverse communities, the very communities that will be most affected by climate change. This is imperative if we are to achieve true system change and ultimately halt runaway climate breakdown from destroying life on Earth as we know it. And I think if the COVID-19 situation has taught us anything, it's that we are hugely unprepared for a crisis on the scale that climate change sits. But it's also taught us, I think, that the impossible can be made possible. So in this talk, we will look at how colonialism, social injustice, and the climate emergency shapes the global Black experience of ecocide. And with me tonight to do this, I have an amazing panel: internationally recognized reparations activist, co-founder of Stop the Mangamizi, We Charge Genocide and Ecocide campaign, and a coordinator for Extinction Rebellion, Internationalist Solidarity Network, Esther Stanford-Xosei. Hi Esther, thanks for joining us tonight. We also have senior lecturer at the Law School of the University of Bristol, whose teachings focus on decolonizing legal thought, Dr. Foluke Adebisi. Thanks for joining us tonight. And we also have the Green Councillor Cotham, former Lord Mayor for Bristol, and community activist Cleo Lake. Thanks for joining us, Cleo. And last but certainly not least, long-serving community organiser, former chair of African Voices Forum, and primary school teacher Sauda Kyalambuka. Thank you all for joining me. Before we get the questions underway, I would love to introduce Kabbo Hue Ferdinand, who will be reading some poetry tonight. Kabbo, thanks for joining us.
Claiming my own liberty, I'm setting myself free on this earth's beautiful journey, finding like-spirited beings as me, you, healing me as wounded being, who I am that I am, who I am that I am, who I am because of you I am, who I am that I am. Ubuntu. If God had a face, it would look like mine, lurking in the shadows of an over-imaginative mind. What shall I find? Looking in your eyes, whose I to be? Extinct declared in the gene, me. Yes, her face looked like mine. At the bottom of the seabed, she opened her eyes. Forgotten, so-called subhuman, he no longer be. She no longer be. In this memory of me, left me scrambling for sense, bloodshot, hand up, clutching at smoke. Fuming, fueling, fuels, furnace. For as it goes, lies sold as abstract truth, glaringly glows, blindingly bright, blightings bite, brought to you by bowing bigots. Behold, tricked and unearthed by baseless brokers, bounders and breakers, of sod-soiled souls, of souls sold for profit. Now I'm still to honor from the pit, the seed in all my being, the leaping of desperate souls, chained, promise of death, certain acts of courage, despite the harrowing. I'm ready. It will take more than hell's gnashing teeth cacophony to throw me off the trail, telling me it's run cold. I ain't fool. It had to be his fault. My kin made me a believer. When I asked why, no one knows. The preacher man said, God hath giveth, God hath taketh away. God hath giveth, God hath taketh away. Who I am that I am. Who I am that I am. I am because of you. Because of you I am. Who I am. I am that I am. Ubuntu, face of God, eternally, for eternity. I
in terms of Pan-Africanism, there is a misperception, and many standard texts on Pan-Africanism will talk about Pan-Africanism as it has been shaped, in particular in the so-called 20th century, by people of African heritage in the diaspora. But actually, if we take a decolonial approach to Pan-Africanism, we can see that the efforts at African unification and building civilization and actually organizing in a way that we could sustain ourselves, what people today would call sustainable development, began on the continent of Africa. And throughout many different phases of African history, prior to what we, in the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, refer to as the Maangamizi, which is the African Holocaust, there were these efforts to unify ourselves and to build polities that were based on a recognition of a cultural unity of the people of Africa. So in that vein, I would say that from our own standpoint, in terms of our own research and organizing with African people, both on the continent and in the diaspora, we would say that Pan-Africanism is an anti-imperialist, decolonizational movement, rallying together a broad array of all Africa-loving forces that are interested in link networking globally in pursuit of various configurations of an independent, worldwide, political, ideological, cultural, and organizational framework of struggle for the total liberation, unification, and self-determined progression of Africans and their kith and kin worldwide. So the point about Pan-Africanism, especially as it has been shaped by African people from the motherland, the continent of Africa, is that it has always been a movement which was about how do we ecologically and in an environmentally friendly and sustainable way, people our planet with a clear sense of responsibility to ensure that we left no or very little carbon footprint. Because for our ancestors, they saw themselves very much as part of nature and not separate from it, and not in a way that became, you know, part of the sort of negative perceptions of Africans during colonialism, but inherently we knew that we were intimately connected to nature and the earth. And so the way in which we peopled our societies and we formed societies and communities and traversed the continent of Africa, as well as the globe actually, was a way in which was in resonance with, in harmony with, in recognition that we and our Mother Earth are one. So there is this intimate connection in terms of now the struggle to resist foreign domination and impositions, which were very much about removing us from our way of life and our symbiotic relationship that we had, which was about living in harmony with nature, with our land, and actually caring for the land and for each other as we would ourselves. So that is, for me, in a nutshell, what are some of the connections between Pan-Africanism and now the climate and ecological emergency. And so from the time that we experienced various forms of colonization, our efforts could no longer just be directed towards building ourselves and trying to develop sustainable societies in Africa or sustainable communities. We also then had to resist the negative impositions on us that sought to remove us from our way of life and our way of living in harmony with, with the earth. And many of our liberators, those who we recognize in terms of traditional studies of Pan-Africanism and research on Pan-Africanism, spoke about this. They spoke about, we have people, one of the great ones for me is Amilcar Cabral, and he spoke a lot in his own organizing and his own liberation praxis, which was about the need for African people to return to source and to resist, if you like, the cultural domination that had been imposed upon us and had totally disordered our societies, disempowered us, and dispossessed us. And with that brought in, especially if we tie that in with the chattelization of African people and the mass trafficking, you see the beginning of this modern phase, the so-called industrialization phase, and how our efforts to unify ourselves then had to also contend with wrestling back control away from colonizers and trying to restore ourselves, restore our sovereignty, and restore our connections and our vicegerency over land and being a steward of land and all the resources that are required to sustain human populations.
Dr. Adebisi, I wonder what you have to say on the issue of what Pan-Africanism is and how it's linked to the climate and ecological emergency.
I would say it's quite difficult to add much to what Sister Esther has said, because she's covered quite a lot of ground on what Pan-Africanism is. I think one of the keys for me is that Pan-Africanism is about liberation. And I think Sister Esther says, she's mentioned that quite clearly, the fact that Pan-Africanism has been misunderstood, in some cases been co-opted. If Pan-Africanism, as people are articulating it, is not working towards freedom, then in my opinion, it is not Pan-Africanism. And how does it relate to climate emergency? Again, this is just to add on to what Sister Esther has said. My approach is very much from an academic or knowledge, a question of knowledge deconstruction, if we put it that way. There's a history to the climate emergency, just as there's a history to Pan-Africanism. So you have on the one hand liberation, and on the other hand injustice. There will be no need for questions of liberation if there were no questions of injustice in the first place. So climate emergency and Pan-Africanism in that sense run parallel, because there is a history of injustice about the environment, and the way in which I kind of look at it is it's the epistemic ideas or knowledge, the way in which knowledge is formed about things like land, things like nature, and the way knowledge is formed about people, people of African descent and how we relate to that nature. So to summarize, Pan-Africanism is related to climate emergency because the way in which we've formed knowledge about nature has been destructive across history, and it will continue to be destructive until we change how we understand land, how we understand nature, and how we understand the relationship of people to land and nature.
Cleo, I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Pan-Africanism, for me, is about collective capacity and agency. It's about linking internationally across the African diaspora, and it is about, as already mentioned, kind of tapping in and relearning and educating ourselves as African heritage people about indigenous practice, about how historically we had that connection to the land, to nature, but also to the cosmos. So making sense of our space within the universe, really taking it on that massive, massive scale. And it's something that people might perceive to be something that's over there or outside or far away. But for me, it's always got to be about what are we doing on a small level, whether it's for yourself or your street or your community. So it's definitely about that action. It's not about reading a load of books. Whilst that might be important, that can be a distraction from doing the action. And it's about also giving voice to people who are our leaders, whether they want to be considered as leaders or not. It's giving more spotlight to them, because in this day and age, I reflected it and I thought some of the people who we consider, pioneers of the movement or big names in Pan-Africanism, how would they fare today with popularity contests, with social media, with getting the message out there, with fake news? I think it would be a different environment. So I think it's really important that we elevate voices, and that's exactly what you're hoping to do tonight, which I congratulate you on. So yeah, for me, it's about going back to basics in a way of who we are in terms of human beings, and being in a position where other people who haven't listened to our broken record for decades and decades and decades, now they might actually give a window of opportunity to be able to understand there may be another way of doing things, there may be another way of seeing the world, and that will be crucial, because holding back communities that have fostered civilization ultimately just holds us all back.
Last but certainly not least, Sauda, what say you on the question of what is Pan-Africanism to you and how is it linked to the climate and ecological emergency?
For me, Pan-Africanism is about the unity of all Africans. And when I think of some of our heroes and sheroes, I think of like Kwame Nkrumah, former president of Ghana. I think of Queen Nzinga from Angola. And the idea of the pyramids of Egypt, that couldn't have been built without unification from Africa. And even, today Africa has united, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. But when you think about, they've united in sport because they have the African League of Nations, but I was listening to another Zoom meeting recently by University College, London School of Economics it was, and they were talking about COVID-19 and what lessons they've learned and how they're working together. And they were asking for funding, and it's always that looking outside. Africa is a massive continent. It has so much resources. I would love to see more unity with Africans working with Africans. You need some maize, you've got drought, we can give you some. So I'd like to see more unity. But yeah, so that's what I want to say about it, is that for me, it's about Africans uniting to solve their problems. I understand that, just trying to feed people means they're taking an eye off the global problem, because that's like 30, 50 years down the line. But we need to prepare for that, and it's our children that are going to be suffering at the end of the day, if we don't unify ourselves. So for me, yeah, that's what it's about.
Just something that really interested me about what you were saying in terms of unification. What methods do you think can be employed to achieve that unity and solidarity?
Well, I think partnerships, you know, we definitely need partnerships. We need to work together. No man is an island, as they say, you know, so those partnerships, because this thing is global, you know, it's not just affecting Africa. I mean, if people in Africa are dying because of drought and flood, you know, it affects the whole world. Yeah, so partnerships, we need to work together. I know we had the 2018 Paris Agreement and the campaign around that. I haven't heard anything about that. Most of the research that I've been looking at was from 2019 December. So, you know, this issue seems to have fallen off. I know we've got COVID that we're dealing with, but, you know, this climate emergency situation seems to have fallen off everyone's radar. So, you know, what we need is, it's because it's a long-term thing, but we need to put some short-term steps. But I think partnership is definitely what needs to happen.
Cleo, I was just wondering what you thought about those comments about, you know, achieving that unification and solidarity. How do we do that in a world that is so connected, but yet seems so far apart in many ways?
It's a challenge. It has been a challenge. You know, we can think of perhaps forums or meetings, etc., where you tend to have the same people around the table. So it is about how do you extend that. I think, you know, and probably Esther will talk about this, having bodies, institutions, building institutions like the Global African People's Parliament. For me, when I found out about that a few years ago, it really excited me because I thought, okay, great, there's the alternative that all of us, whatever country we're in, we can get in and get underneath and actually start to build something for ourselves that is outside of the Western way of doing things. It's something for ourselves. So I think right now there is a great opportunity. I've met people, I've attended webinars and connected with people online that I would never have done if I hadn't been in this situation of having to stay home, etc., etc. So I think the digital aspects can't be undermined, because that is a way that we can get information out there and now connect a lot with each other, even through being a dance artist. Today I took part in a Haitian dance workshop delivered from New York. That's connecting us. So it's all of those kind of things. And sometimes going through the guise of whether it's exercise, entertainment, is also a way of spreading the message and connecting people.
Esther, just because Cleo mentioned you, I'm eager to get your take on how we achieve that unification and solidarity in a world that can seem so divided at times.
The struggle for Pan-Africanism has always been has a concrete objective, and it was about creating African civilization and culture that is land and territory based, you know, basically about restoring our homeland, our motherland, Africa, without any exception, and that includes all of Africa, including North Africa. So the physical struggle to actually reclaim Africa and to wrestle Africa out of the hands of multinationals that are asserting aspects of ownership of lands and resources that are there to sustain the people is a concrete struggle. So there can be no real African unity or, you know, Pan-Africanism in that sense that is not tied to that struggle. And in that sense, then we have to look at how do we support the movements, the organizations, the groupings, the networks, the various people that are part of these different efforts to do so. And Sister Cleo did mention the Global African People's Parliament, for instance, as one example, and linked to that, especially in Bristol, where many of you are based, is the African Connections Consortium. And the Global African People's Parliament in particular has this approach about unifying people here in the UK, but also across the world in different kind of diaspora settings with our motherland. So the various peoples and communities. It's a very concrete thing and has been, is actually demonstrated by initiatives at what's called rematriation. And some people talk about repatriation, but it's really about a rematriation because it's a return to a living material culture. And so we have to find ways of doing that, even though we may be living here or living in Abiyala, the so-called Americas, or the Caribbean, or other parts of Europe. How do we then organize in a way that we are connecting into the different struggles for restoration, for, against dispossessions, for restoration of sovereignty of our people on the ground. And that has been an essential aspect of Pan-Africanism, especially in the context of a UK history. We've always come to the defense of, rallied in support of the struggles around dispossessions, and all around we're connected to those struggles of dispossession. So even if people are living here, say in the UK, the struggles around access to land, access to housing, space, material space, a different built environment are very much connected to those struggles that are back home and in other diaspora settings that are looking about how do we even have the space to develop institutions where we can develop our culture in a very tangible way. We can grow our own food, we can educate our children, we can teach them about who they are, and that history does not start with chattel enslavement or the beginnings of the Maangamizi, as we would say. It's really about the whole wealth of who we have been and what we have bequeathed, not only to ourselves, but to the rest of human civilization. And how do we actually institutionalize that in a way that is international, that is global, but acting in a way as we do that is global. So we begin from wherever we're at, but we see ourselves as a people that are connected to our people, irrespective of whatever descriptors people ascribe to us, or we may even ascribe to ourselves on the basis of so-called different national identities.
So following on from that, Dr. Adebisi, unity, how do we achieve it, given what Esther, Cleo and Sauda have said on the matter?
To give a slightly flippant answer, or I'll start with a slightly flippant answer, I think just do it. Almost every Pan-African meeting I've been to has involved that question of, how do we build solidarity? And I think a lot of it is we're not ready to. But I think on the flip side of that, there are already, solidarities that Sister Esther has mentioned, that Sister Cleo has mentioned, that Sister Sauda has mentioned. There are already solidarities on the ground. So I think there has to be a point in which we say there are solidarities and we need to keep on doing what we're doing right, while recognizing that we're not going to get everybody on board. So I think for me, that's it. Build on what we already have and try not to be pessimistic about people who are not yet joining.
So then the second question that I want to ask is, how do we actually decolonize the climate movement whilst recognizing that colonization actually formed the basis on which climate injustice has been built over time and exists today?
You could perceive this question in a number of ways. We're constantly hearing, why aren't certain people engaged in the climate movement? And of course, that's a nonsense, because many, many people are engaged in the movement. How do we know what conversations people are having in their homes, previously in their community centres, down the pub, wherever else people gather? We can't, people aren't having these conversations and that they're not taking it seriously. Some people prefer to just have their lives quiet and they don't put everything out there. So first of all, I think it's a bit of a nonsense to suggest that people aren't engaged and aren't aware, because I believe that they are. There was a significant piece of work done just a matter of weeks ago, actually, Climate Reframe, which actually lists a whole raft of people in the UK of different backgrounds who are involved in the movement, who do speak out, who do actions. It's an extensive resource that also gives people who maybe are thinking of doing work or having a discussion, etc., etc. It gives them a reference point to say, well, actually, there is someone of Bangladesh heritage, or there is someone of Jamaican heritage, or there is someone else who you can involve in the conversation, because we do exist. Sometimes perhaps it's certain peoples who are kind of, you know, wanting to shape the narrative or taking more control of certain forums as to why you don't see a lot of this. But I think another element is more about actually the priority. And when we talk about decolonising the climate movement, there's a lot of things we also need to do that go hand in hand with that, with the climate movement, which is obviously a major concern, is top of the agenda for many people. But just to kind of push it in another direction, for me, also we need a poverty emergency. I would love it if all the people who've supported XR would also support a declaration of a global poverty emergency, which is also a huge legacy of colonization. And for me, that is as important, if not more important, at the moment.
Dr. Adebisi, to follow on from what Cleo said, how can we decolonise the climate movement and recognise all of the other struggles that go alongside that?
That's a really big question, and I'm going to try and avoid giving a lecture. I think one of the problems we have here is a fundamental misunderstanding of decolonization or decoloniality or decolonial theory as a thing. So lots of people, when they talk about, and you know, this kind of builds up on what Sister Cleo has just said, when they talk about decolonizing the climate movement, they're kind of saying, let's bring in other voices, rather than let's do things differently. So it doesn't really, we then don't really recognize what people have doing already. So then the idea is sort of like in African communities, there's no climate movement going on. But, you know, and we've alluded to this much earlier, there's a history on the African continent and among African peoples, which recognizes nature, the environment as paramount. Even though those movements, those understandings, those knowledges haven't been couched in terms of climate change or climate emergency. So, and, you know, alluding to what Sister Cleo said again about, you know, let's have a poverty, anti-poverty movement. Again, this all ties in, you know, to all the, you know, it ties into, it's essentially the same thing. You cannot divorce the things that are causing the climate emergency from the things which are causing poverty. So one of the things that, you know, kind of center my work, and I think I mentioned, it's the commodification of land. So if we take that as an example, and I think Sister Esther mentioned this, that you've got lots of indigenous populations, and these are not just African populations, who culturally and historically have a very different relationship to the land. And I can think about land as property. It's a very colonized standing of land. It's if you think about other types of property that we have, so things like, you know, cars, shoes, the idea that you can own things that are movable, you can dispose of them, you can lay claim to them, own them, makes some sort of sense. But the idea that you can lay claim to land and own land, I would say it's in itself is perverse. But it also is at the very basis of the way in which the global divide has been built. The idea that you could go into Africa, and you know, Africa wasn't the only colonized place, but you can go into Africa and then say, I own this, is very perverse. But this idea, this almost legal idea, the idea that we can lay legal claim, ownership to a piece of land and therefore commodify it, and the land is only useful if it yields certain profits, leads to the destruction, or has led to the destruction, of vast amounts of the environment. So then you can see, you know, the relationship between colonization and, you know, the climate emergency. So to decolonize the climate emergency, so going back to your question, I'm trying not to give a lecture here. So going back to your question, to decolonize the climate debate or the climate movement, we have to tie in that history. Possible to say, well, what we're doing in the West, let's bring in African voices, where you have completely ignored the injustices that have happened to the African people. You've completely ignored their understandings of land, what they have been doing. So the anti-colonial movement is is part of the climate debate. You're not bringing it in. It existed before the climate debate in, you know, in this part of the world. The understanding of land as not property, but as an essential part of, you know, this symbiotic relationship we have with the earth existed way before the climate movement. We're not bringing it into the climate debate. We're making sure that the climate debate is saying the right things. So to decolonize the climate debate, we need to reposition our understanding of the world. We need to understand that we have got it wrong, which is why we have a climate emergency in the first place. And then we need to get it right. So, and this is why, you know, I always say decolonization is not diversity. The world is super diverse. So saying you want to make the climate debate, you know, more diverse where the world is already diverse, again, that is perverse. Or decolonization is about representation. If the structure, or if, you know, the knowledge basis is wrong, making more people is not helpful. What we're saying is, and you know, very much the leading on what the Latin American school says, there are ways of living otherwise. There are worlds otherwise. The world that we're currently living in, the way in which we've structured the foundations of the world, is destructive. It will always lead to oppression and injustice for certain populations. Doesn't matter what happens. You've got COVID-19, and then you've got, you know, certain populations are suffering more than others. Climate change, exactly the same thing. So, and then we then begin to say, well, can we help these people so that they don't suffer that much? Rather than maybe there's something wrong with the way in which we've structured our world. So first we have to understand what decolonization is. We have to understand the history of the world, and we have to reverse that.
I think Cleo was talking about who says that people from diverse backgrounds are not talking about climate change. And I was thinking with the part that the media plays in this, because we don't hear the other side. Certainly there are lots of Africans campaigning about the climate emergency. And I was even thinking in Bristol here, we have the Green and Black Project, and we're all meeting here today. So we obviously do care about the issues, and there are lots of other people who care about the issues. But I'm thinking about decolonizing the curriculum as well, because it's the same kind of thing. But for me, it's about education at the end of the day, in particular young people. And we need to see more of our young people going to university and studying subjects like technology and science. And all these kind of things would help to spread the message. You know, so these are the kind of things I've been thinking about. And in terms of land, yes, we know that the land issue is a big issue in Africa. I mean, that was the other thing is debt as well, debt. So there's a lot of things to be unpicked before we can actually talk about what's really going on. And I know Esther could enlighten us a bit more on that as well.
For me, one of the key ways is the need, and it's linked to what Sister Foluke was talking about in terms of recognizing the historicity of the activism that Africans and other indigenous peoples have been engaged in. So this notion that the climate movement is white and is European led is a myth, because that just is not borne out in history. And picking up on some of the comments I made earlier in relation to the fact that the issues of tackling climate and ecological crisis and dispossession that have had ecocidal, as well as, if you like, genocidal impacts, has been very much part and parcel of the continued struggle for African liberation, which is continuing to this day. So we have to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth about who this movement is, what is this movement, and not just see it as just some, you know, something that just emerged. And even though we're part of Extinction Rebellion International Solidarity Network in terms of the Stop the Mangamizi campaign, we co-founded it. We also internally with Extinction Rebellion also challenge this notion that somehow the rebellion started in October 2018, because actually the rebellion, as has been waged by colonized peoples, African peoples, indigenous peoples from, you know, the four corners of the earth, has been something they have been engaged in for centuries. And so this is what we need to do. We need to reframe the discussion. We need to tell the truth. We need to recognize the initiatives that people have already been engaged in and how they articulate the notion of climate and ecological crisis. It's not just a singular issue, because that is connected to land struggles. It's connected to, you know, the struggles around impoverishment and access to resources. It's connected to so-called pro-democracy movements that we see all across Africa. It's connected to many of the people's struggles. We don't have the luxury of just isolating, as thinking that we can isolate climate and ecology from our day-to-day lives. So in that regard, we recognize that there are multiple intersecting emergencies. And one of the things that, now speaking as part of the Extinction Rebellion International Solidarity Network, that we champion, and it's important to say that our whole reason for existing as the XRISN, as we call ourselves, is to foster mutually respectful, cooperative and beneficial connections with people from existing communities of resistance, that's the key thing, on the front lines of the climate and ecological crisis in the global south and the global north, who are working on environmental justice so that, one, these perspectives on resistance, rebellion, transformation, how we live in harmony with our Mother Earth, the cosmos, nature, and members of the human family get represented through our XR UK. And secondly, to ensure that there's two-way learning between XR UK and the various, you know, tentacles of XR UK and people from these communities of resistance, and by extension, many of these other movements. So we're providing this bridge, and a big part of that is about the re-education. Okay, the re-education process, changing the narrative, telling the truth about the nature of this struggle and this history. And in that regard, it's important for me to also mention in the African context that this work and this approach, which, although I recognize there are many different formations of African organizing, but this one that links the struggle to, if you like, avert the climate and ecological emergency, to stop ecocide, and also inherent within that genocide, or even the notion of what's called cultural ecocide. There is formations such as one of our Global South partner networks in Africa, which is the Extinction Rebellion Affinity All African Network, which is XRAN. Because what XRAN does, it is working with representatives of these various communities of resistance who are involved in various struggles, but all connecting now. And they may not, typically, if you look at them or even understand what they're trying to do, be seen as climate justice activists. because they are not conceptualizing how we avert the climate and ecological crisis in that narrow way. So let us recognize those efforts. I mean, many people, and there's been a lot of negative press around XR and XR so white, but then at the same time, there is a denial and a lack of recognition of those of us who have been engaging with XR from its founding, and who have actually helped to shape and transform XR and even introduce some of these discussions and these connections with movements. That needs to be recognized. And we mustn't keep on just kind of eradicating that because it's not comfortable. And I think that we also have to resist, and Sister Foluke alluded to it earlier, this thinking that it's just about diversity or just having some African voices or Asian voices or indigenous people as a way of thinking that's decolonization. No, what we have to do is resist this NGOization of our resistance, and that is also happening by many organizations now thinking, well, the way we do that is just promote certain activists who they'll say are black or brown or whatever, and so it has to go beyond that as well. We have to equally expose and challenge that, the way in which the struggles are actually being redefined, and some of us are complicit in that sort of sanitization of this live resistance and rebellion that is happening today.
Amazing, thank you. And I agree with everything you've all said in regards to recognizing the work that people from the global south, indigenous people from the four corners of the earth, as Esther put it, have already been doing for many, many years. You know, they've been truly on the front line of this battle since before Extinction Rebellion was on the scene, and that's so important to recognize. Brilliant. I want to bring us to our third question, and I think this is the much more sort of difficult question to satisfy in my mind anyway, and it's all about solutions. What are the solutions, and how do we manage to halt the climate emergency in Africa and all over the world, and achieve the planet repairs? How do we do that?
I don't really like questions about solutions because I'm an academic, so yeah, because I think it's easy to say do this, but sometimes what we need to do is think a little bit more. And I know that sounds a little bit academic, but I don't think there's an easy solution, because if you go back to what, my response to the previous question, I said we need to rethink the structure of, the entire world. So how do we, that's not an easy thing to do. And I suspect that because it's so difficult to rethink the world, a lot of people think, well, let's just make it as successful as it can be for the maximum number of people. The problem with that, of course, is those who have been pushed to the sidelines continue to be pushed to the sidelines further and further. So for me, that's not a viable option. So we need to go back to this question of rethinking the entire world, but then how do we do it? So I suggest that there are 4 things we should be doing. And again, my answer is going to be quite academic, apart from one bit of those 4 things. I think we need to question. And I think we have got to a point where we have easily accepted that where we are is where we should be. I think we no longer question. So I think we should continue at all times to be questioning what we have, where we can go, and what this world can possibly be. But I think the other one would be read. And again, that's quite academic, but I suspect it would be a good thing if we could read more and more, not just about, climate change movements now, but about, decolonizing and decolonization and things that have happened before, what people are imagining, the world to be. So we need to understand, so the third point would be to understand the very nature of the world. And you cannot do that without questioning, without reading, before then you begin to understand and imagine. But I think the 4th point would always be action. It's it's very easy to go on reading and questioning and, you know, carrying on intellectually without actually doing anything. So I think action is important. But I think overall, and, you know, not to be too almost esoteric about it, there is room for radical imagination. There's room for... Are we on? Yeah, yeah. Oh, my God. Where?
Hello.
You cannot see, just... Where are we? Demi? Where are we? Demi, can you go on that? Yeah, but where are we? You can't see it, sorry. Oh. Sorry.
No problem at all.
Yeah, so there's room for radical imagination, and to a certain extent, and a lot of people would know this about me, even though a lot of my work is on decolonization, I do try and avoid using that word all the time, because I think sometimes when we say decolonization, we're saying one thing and lots of people who are listening are hearing other things. And this is why, you know, I think the literal meaning of radical imagination is very important. You know, thinking about worlds otherwise, who's at the center of our understanding? The idea that when we are imagining new worlds, are we imagining them as coterminous and synonymous with what we already have? So, you know, say you take the example of Africa, you know, after the supposed decolonization of Africa, the colonies became states. Is that a, you know, undoing? Is that a world otherwise, or is that a world the same? It's essentially a world the same. So you go from colony to state. Some of them change their names. Then you have, you know, African heads of state. But essentially the state operates the same way as before. In the same way, you cannot have a solution to climate change, which is a continuation of the injustice or oppression that we have now. What would our ideal world look like? Write that down and then find ways to get there. So that would be my answer.
Sauda, you know, you're a primary school teacher. Are there any solutions that can be easily achieved in your mind of how to halt climate change and achieve those planet repairs?
Basically, it needs to come from the people at the bottom, and we need to petition our politicians in terms of fossil fuels. I think the government has two options: either to ban it or to put taxes on it so it's too expensive to be used. Yeah, I think things like eating less meat. I think of things like planting more trees and involving all the young people. Obviously, it has to start with the children. In terms of schools, we do a lot. We do recycling. We raise awareness of what's going on with the ozone layer, and we need to invest in new technology and initiatives. And this is why I was saying that we need to encourage our children to be scientists, to be researchers, to be engineers. You know, I think the solution has to lie with young people. If you know how passionate they are about global issues, and it's up to us to give them the tools, it's up to us to give them the information so that they can take it forward. And also teachers need training to teach the sensitive subjects. We talked a lot about them today, about land and about drought and about famine. You know, all of these things, it can be quite sensitive when you think of colonialization and imperialism. Why are we where we are today? So, you know, teachers do need training to teach that. So I would like to think that there are solutions. I mean, Africa is already doing a lot. It's not as if they're sitting down saying, oh, we need help. You know, some African countries have called on the United Nations to declare a global climate emergency. So I just think that the momentum has to come from the bottom up.
Cleo, what's your perspective on how we solve the climate and ecological emergency, if we even can, and achieve the planet repairs that are so needed?
Definitely the idea of a radical imagination, trying to take people on a journey in their mind to understand that how things are now and how we perceive things now doesn't have to be our reality. We can look at things way, way back historically and understand there would have been a different way of doing things, a different practice. So I think for some people, unless they can see something in action, it's very, very hard for them to believe it can be a reality. And a lot of people, I think, are in a box of thinking, well, this is how it is. It's always them, someone else who has the power, has the control, has the say, and I've just got to accept my lot. That isn't the way it needs to be at all. But again, trying to find devices to take people on that creative future imagination, I think is really, really important. There's loads of things that come to mind, things like food sovereignty. And it ties in, of course, with education for everyone, no matter what age or background you are. Principles, things, simple things, again, starting with self, looking at herbalism, looking at what is on your doorstep. For me, since lockdown, I've been out in my garden, and maybe once upon a time, someone would have said, well, that's a weed. Okay. But now I educate myself. I find out what is that plant that's growing in abundance on my doorstep. Okay, I can eat that. It's got more nutrition than something I'm going to buy at the shop. It's about learning and then sharing that learning with other people so that on a local level, you can have some sort of control. What are we thinking about when we think about ecocide? Well, is using a harmful pesticide on our streets? That is ecocide, as far as I'm concerned. From I know that certain weeds are growing, weeds in inverted commas, let's reframe weeds. Herbs are growing in abundance, and there's a drive for certain institutions almost to eradicate these, which has a knock-on effect to insect and other plant life, and ultimately us. That's ecocide that's happening on our doorstep. Also, I would recommend people, if they haven't seen the film, The Last Black Man of San Francisco, which I watched recently. Highly recommend. It's a great film. You can escape in it in a bit. It actually frames plants and trees in a very beautiful way, and it deals with gentrification and also a creative imagination as a way of survival. But what's also interesting when I watched that film, which was only earlier this week, was that it occurred to me actually that any development on land, it could be right here in Bristol, any development that doesn't put a social purpose at the heart of it, so it could be a massive building with no social housing, that is ecocide for me now. And it wasn't, I didn't make that ultimate connection until I saw the film and I saw how poetically they showed people digging up an area that meant something to some people. So we have to look at what is happening on our doorsteps and how can we resist what is happening on our doorsteps. And also going back to this idea of things could be different, it would also be sharing information. So I'm lucky enough to have many good friends over in Ghana, in the Accra region. And, it's being on social media and been able to highlight things like the idea of a universal basic income, which more people are talking about now as a way forward. That if that was a way forward, then that would also have an impact on this climate situation. And friends pick up on this wherever they are in the world, although it feels like it's something that would be happening in the UK or happening in America, universal basic income. Of course, it's entirely possible to be happening globally if we can shift the way that things are going. And in line with that, it is about also learning things that we've lost and going back and picking up concepts that we've lost. What is our cultural frame? How do you govern your way of life? Is it through the legal system? Is it through UK Parliament? A lot of the time it will be, whether you stay on that line or not. But is there something bigger that should override all of that? And if that's the case, then we all need to get on board and actually get to a point where we say, we've built this now.
I think we may have lost Cleo for the time being. Completely agree with everything she has just said. Esther, how do you see that we can solve the climate emergency? Can we even solve it with one stroke? And how do we achieve the planet repairs?
Linked to how we began the discussion and talking about Pan-Africanism and its connection to tackling the climate and the ecological emergency, and I spoke about the struggle for Pan-Africanism being a very concrete struggle that was tied to restoration of land and our connection to land, then that is a big part of it. So in the Stop the Mangamese campaign, and also within Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network, we have been championing this notion of planet repairs, realizing that the very life system that we have supposedly has actually been a way of death and destruction. And at this time with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's many people around the world, especially African people, indigenous peoples, who are resisting and coming to the realization that also not only is COVID-19 an aspect of ecocide, but also it is how it is playing out is that it is becoming a tool of genocide. And what our network partners, in particular in Africa, have been telling us is that on the ground, people are mobilizing against what they see as a real threat of depopulation and an attempt to just remove many people from the planet, because the people who are in control do not have respect for human life. Okay, and so if we are to truly have planet repairs, then we have to look at every kind of system. We need total system change, and within that we need to think about models of how do we relate to each other as members of the human family. In that regard, within the Stop the Mangamese campaign and supported by Extinction Rebellion International Solidarity Network, we have been championing the notion of part of this planet repair is looking at what we call Ubuntu man in the African context. So that is an African idea of nationhood that is not, let's state-centric. It is based on the unification of peoples, indigenous peoples, that actually transcend existing state borders, which are seen as part of, you know, the structural violence that has separated ethnicity from ethnicity, nationality from nationality. But we recognize that it's not just about us, that in order to even sustain a Ubuntu man, which is this basically a super state, but based on these, you know, building blocks, these pillars of African, I would say, revolutionary intercommunalism, we also have to exist in a world that is repairing itself. And that is where we link now with all the other peoples on the planet, especially indigenous peoples who are also struggling for similar things. And many of them have said sovereignty, including land, you know, reconnecting people to land, and then being able to live in harmony with the land, and food sovereignty and all the other types of sovereignty that go with that are part of what people have been organizing by way of the repair. They're not stating the solution, they've been doing it. Because part of what colonization did was remove the people who were the natural custodians and whose knowledge systems were much more harmonious, and actually brought in a system of colonization that was about privatization of the commons. And that is what we have seen. So we need to link with those other peoples who are also struggling to repair And in that sense, we recognize that Ma'atu Ubuntu man, this future state, that the building blocks are there now. So we're working, there's the Global African Family Reunion International Council, the Global African People's Parliament, where we're located here in the UK, around this. And many of the resistance movements are actually in resistance to not only imagine, but to physically forge new intercommunalism, new forms of relating to each other. But that cannot exist outside of this world where we are also repairing ourselves. If not, you will have the people who wield power, economic, military, and otherwise, continuing to dispossess the majority of humanity. And actually, we will have an intensification of the climate and ecological emergency. So we talk about Ubuntu Dunia, which is really a pluriversal world of many worlds. And this is something that chimes with what many indigenous peoples have been saying to us. We need to recognize pluriversality, that these other worlds are being prefigured right now. And what will not be finished will be continued by future generations if we are here. But that is the real challenge. We really avert ecocide so that we can ensure that we have survival. And that is what many of the movements, including in the UK, the African Emancipation Day Reparations March from 2015 has been on the streets in the UK talking about we charge genocide, we charge ecocide. This was long before even now people really thinking in a more popular way about how can we actually stop ecocide. So this is the thing, we have these remnants, we have these imaginings, we have these actions going on, but we're not paying attention to them. And that's what we need to correct even amongst us.
Cleo, I just wanted to give you the chance to finalise your points because you got cut off.
Yeah, it was just to go back to the idea of land rights, which obviously has come up a few times. We live wherever we want. For me, the whole world is Africa. So it's very important what we do locally and what we do globally. And again, going back to what I was saying, it is about, as Esther's mentioned, this new world is being built by people who've been in the struggle, in the movement for generations. It does exist. And it's about adding to that and building that so that we're in a position where, well, I would like to be in a position where I don't have to recognize my life reduced to a bit of paper or something that's written, my rights written on some legal document somewhere. I don't want to be reduced to that anymore. I don't want my community to be reduced to that anymore. We're bigger than that. We're more than that. Our purpose is far greater than anything that can be reduced to a few lines on a bit of paper. So I think we need the audacity to reclaim ourselves and take ourselves forward. Esther mentioned earlier, and I don't have the question in front of me, so I'm presuming perhaps you're talking either about African heritage groups or perhaps wider than that. I think African Connections Consortium is a good starting point in Bristol. It's about being active and it's about doing what we're doing already, having these conversations, but dedicating time and committing and having actions that we can move forward with and hold ourselves accountable to in terms of a stepping stone to what we're trying to create. So I think, you know, going back to climate reframe is another resource that could be used to actually dig deep and find out who's doing what where and how we can actually link. So having awareness of who's doing what is a very good starting point.
It works on two levels. So in the UK or in a European context, I know that there's great resistance, even ideologically, to the notion of Pan-Africanism. It's very rarely studied, for instance, in educational institutions. When there are movements, social movements that emerge, and there's a recognition of many different movements, there's very little recognition of a Pan-African movement. So just at the, you know, the level of epistemology, that happens across the board. And one of the things that many of us as activists, Pan-African activists, have encountered is that there is this fear of actually Pan-Africanism, because it actually goes beyond many of the existing frameworks and the narrow limitations and boxes that people try to put other box people in. So that's the way in which many people are working against it. I would say that even in terms of the denial of our, you know, the unsettlement, if you like, of the African national question is a way in which Pan-Africanism is being denied. So many of the existing emerged from, however long ago, are part of the problem, because these were neo-colonial Bantustans, as our scholars have told us, that were designed to not empower the indigenous people of Africa. They were designed to empower and to benefit and to materially resource the colonial nations. And so the great Kwame Nkrumah, in his neo-colonialism, spoke about this being the last stage of imperialism, whereby we have this semblance of being or having so-called independence and self-governance, but actually our economies, our political systems, all the systems of governance are controlled by people outside. So that is still concretely happening today. The way in which we name ourselves, the identity misrecognition, BAME, all kinds of things for African. We're in the decade, international, United Nations, international decade for people of African descent. And it's even a problem for some people to recognize that we are African and we assert our right to an African identity. We're even denied that. Because no, we're told, oh, well, what about everyone else? Oh no, other people like this term, people of color. So just even to call ourselves, it's a problem. Yeah. This is what our children are facing, and then we wonder why they are turning that violence in against themselves and committing reactionary suicide. We wonder because they've been denied true knowledge of everything that they are and everything that their people have done and contributed, and they do not quite understand their place in society and why they are still, despite everything that we have given to the world and the birthing of human civilization, they are still oppressed, they are still dispossessed, even here in the UK where we live.
I think they have to see unity amongst us, you know, as a community. I think African Voices Forum does a very good job. You know, we have a number of African organizations who have the same objectives, and we come together and we work around those objectives. So I think it's important that they see examples, and I think it goes quite deep, even down to our hair, because if we're not proud of who we are and in our natural state, if we try to be somebody else, you know, what is that telling our children? So I think it starts with the individual, as Esther was saying, acknowledging that we are Africans. You know, I have, I wouldn't say it's still going on now, but some parents from Jamaica would say, no, I'm not African. You know, so we have to, and you know, it goes back to this negative image of Africa. And I don't know why we're not proud of our heritage. We're not proud of our names. You know, I wasn't born in Africa. I was born in Britain. You know, I've been to Jamaica, I've been to Egypt. But there's some of us that don't want to know anything about Africa. we don't think it's necessary to pass on that knowledge to our children, you know, and that saddens me, because if we don't know where we're from, how do we know where we're going? You know, so I think it definitely starts with the individual, and it starts with the community. And we do have a struggle to assert our blackness, you know, so some people say you're too black, you know, and I don't know, but, you know, it's very important that we have a positive identity for ourselves, and that our children have that positive identity, and they learn about the positive contributions that Africa has given to the world, you know, and it's not just happens in October, you know, it needs to be embedded in the curriculum. This is why we're trying to decolonize the curriculum.
Thank you, everyone. It's been absolutely amazing. I'm so humbled and honoured to have been part of this. So thank you very much.